Close your eyes. Picture ancient Greece. What do you see? Gleaming white marble, almost certainly. The perfect, soaring columns of the Parthenon against a piercing blue sky. You see the serene, thoughtful faces of philosophers, men with noble brows and flowing beards, wrapped in clean white togas. You see the birth of logic, the cradle of democracy, the dawn of Western civilization. It's an image of order, reason, and pristine intellectual beauty. Now, take that pristine image and set it on fire. Because the ancient Greece you were taught in school is a lie. A beautiful, sanitized, carefully curated lie. It's a portrait of a civilization with its most inconvenient, visceral, and brutally human parts surgically removed. The truth is that beneath the cool marble and the high-minded philosophy lay a world seething with sexual practices so public, so ritualized, and so fundamentally alien to our modern sensibilities that they challenge the very definition of a civilized society. What if I told you that the same men who invented formal logic also marched through their cities in ecstatic processions, parading giant, crudely carved phalluses as objects of religious worship? That the fathers of democracy, who so eloquently debated the nature of freedom in the public square, kept their own wives in a state of near imprisonment, locked away in the home, their sole purpose to produce a legitimate heir? What if I told you that these same men, denied intellectual companionship from their spouses, sought it instead from a class of highly educated professional courtesans, the only women allowed to share their wine, their poetry, and their beds, and that the highest form of love, the purest expression of mentorship and civic virtue, was widely considered to be the relationship between a grown man and an adolescent boy? This is the Greece that is hidden in the footnotes, the truth that is painted on the sides of vases that museums often keep in the archives. It is the uncomfortable, unnerving reality of a civilization whose greatest paradox was its relationship with sex itself. For the Greeks, sex was almost never a private act of passion. It was a social weapon, an educational institution, a political statement, a religious sacrament. It was a language spoken in public, and its grammar was written in power, dominance, and ritual. To understand this paradox, to truly see the face behind the serene marble mask, we must journey through the three parallel and often colliding worlds that defined Greek sexuality. First, we will enter the world of men, the exclusive domain of the citizen, the soldier, and the philosopher, where sex was a tool for power and pedagogy in the gymnasium and the symposium. Then, we will cross the forbidden threshold into the world of women, a deeply stratified reality where sex was a domestic duty for the wife, a skilled profession for the courtesan, or a divine, and sometimes deadly, obligation for the priestess. And finally, we will look to the heavens, to the world of the gods, where the divine lusts and brutal conquests of Olympus provided the ultimate excuse for human depravity on earth. This is not the history of marble gods. This is the history of flesh, blood, and paradox. This is ancient Greece unveiled. To be a man in ancient Greece, a citizen man, that is, was to live a life cleaved in two, public and private, mind and body, citizen and husband. But nowhere was this division more pronounced than in the geography of desire. His wife, the mother of his legitimate children, was a fixture of the private, secluded world of the oikos, the home. His passions, his intellectual curiosities, and his most idealized forms of love, however, resided firmly in the public world of men. This world had two primary arenas, the sun-drenched dust of the gymnasium and the wine-soaked shadows of the symposium. It was in these spaces that the Greek male forged his identity, and sex was the hammer he used to do it. Let us first step into the gymnasium, forget the modern concept of a gym as a place of sterile equipment and personal trainers. the Greek gymnasium was the crucible of the citizen. It was a sprawling complex where young men from the ages of 12 to their late teens were sculpted, not just in body, but in mind and civic virtue. They learned mathematics, rhetoric, and philosophy. They trained for war, wrestling naked under the Hellenic sun, and it was here, amidst the grunts of physical exertion and the murmur of philosophical debate, that the institution of pederasty flourished. Pederasty. The word itself is jarring to the modern ear, immediately conjuring images of exploitation and abuse, and let us be clear, by any modern standard that is precisely what it was. Yet, in the social architecture of cities like Athens and Sparta, it was not only accepted but often idealized as the highest form of mentorship. The model was simple and ruthlessly defined by status and age. On one side was the Erastes, the lover, an adult male citizen, typically in his 20s or 30s. On the other was the Eromenos, the beloved, an adolescent boy who had passed puberty but had not yet grown a full beard. The relationship was, on its surface, a contract of exchange. The Erastes was expected to be a guide, a mentor. He would use his wealth, experience, and social connections to educate his young beloved in the ways of the world, in politics, war, and philosophy. He would bestow gifts, compose poetry, and publicly praise the boy's beauty and virtue. In return, the Eromenos was expected to provide his youth, his beauty, and his admiration. He was the vessel for the older man's intellectual and civic legacy. And, implicitly, he was expected to provide sexual gratification. The social gymnastics required to justify this institution were breathtaking. Philosophers like Plato, in his famous dialogue The Symposium, attempted to elevate the concept into a purely intellectual and spiritual pursuit, a platonic love where the boy's physical beauty was merely the first step on a ladder leading to the appreciation of divine, absolute beauty. It was a noble theory, but the reality painted on thousands of surviving vases tells a much earthier story. These images depict scenes of courtship, seduction, and explicit sexual acts. They show the Erastes offering gifts, a rooster, a hare, a lyre, not as tokens of pure mentorship, but as transactional bids in a very physical courtship. The cruelty of the system lay in its unspoken rules and the immense pressure it placed upon the boy. The ideal Eromenos was expected to be modest, to resist his lover's advances, to display a virtuous reluctance. To appear too eager was to be seen as effeminate and base, like a common prostitute. Yet, to refuse the advances of a powerful, influential citizen could have serious social consequences. The boy and his family were caught in a delicate, dangerous dance. The relationship was meant to be temporary, a rite of passage. Once the Eromenos grew a beard, he was expected to graduate from his role, become an Erastes himself, marry a woman, and produce heirs. The roles were rigid. To remain the passive partner into adulthood was to invite scorn and ridicule, to be labeled a knidos, a man who had abdicated his masculine role and was thus unfit for public life. It was a system designed by men, for the benefit of men, where the adolescent boy's body became a training ground for the next generation of citizens. It was education through exploitation, a practice so deeply woven into the fabric of society that even its sharpest critics like Plato could only argue to reform it, not abolish it. When the sun set, the education of the Greek man continued, moving from the gymnasium to the symposium. This was not a mere dinner party. The symposium was a quasi-ritualized, all-male drinking party that was central to Athenian social and political life. Inside the andron, the men's quarters of a private home, citizens would recline on couches arranged in a circle and engage in an evening of wine, poetry, games, and philosophy. It was a space of intellectual freedom, where the most profound ideas of Western thought were born. It was also a space of profound license. And here we meet the second key figure in the sexual world of men, the hetera. The heterae were a class of courtesans unlike any other in the ancient world. They were not common prostitutes, the porni who sold their bodies in brothels. Many heterae were highly educated, skilled in music, rhetoric, and conversation. Often foreigners or freed slaves, they existed in a strange social limbo. They could never be respectable wives, but they enjoyed a degree of freedom and intellectual engagement utterly denied to the cloistered citizen woman. They were, in essence, professional companions for the male elite. A successful hetera was a master of the symposium. She could debate with philosophers, recite epic poetry, and challenge politicians. She was a trophy and a partner, a status symbol for her patron. The famous statesman Pericles, the architect of Athens' golden age, lived openly with a hetera named Aspasia of Miletus. Ancient sources, though often biased, credit her with being a brilliant thinker and rhetorician, claiming that even Socrates sought her counsel. She was a woman who wielded immense indirect power in a world built to deny her any. But this intellectual companionship was always entwined with sex. The symposium was a place where the boundaries of decorum were meant to be blurred by wine. As the night wore on, philosophical debate often gave way to revelry. Voss paintings depict graphic scenes of symposiums turning into orgies. The heterae, alongside flute girls and dancers, were there to provide entertainment that was both intellectual and carnal. They were admired for their minds, but paid for the use of their bodies. Theirs was a precarious existence, a high-wire act of balancing wit and sex, influence and subjugation. A celebrated few, like Aspasia, might achieve fame and security. Most lived and died in a world that valued their intellect, but ultimately defined them by their sexual utility to powerful men. Between the gymnasium and the symposium, the Greek man constructed a world that catered exclusively to his needs. He sought intellectual validation and a sense of virtuous mentorship from boys, and he sought witty companionship and sexual release from courtesans. In both arenas, sex was the currency. It was used to purchase status, to transmit knowledge, to cement political alliances, and to display one's sophistication. It was a public performance, a social ritual that had very little to do with love and everything to do with power. The wife, the cornerstone of the family and the state, was conspicuously absent from both of these worlds. She was a citizen in name only, a ghost in her own society, relegated to a third world, one defined by silence, duty, and darkness. And it is into that world that we must now descend. The 4th century Athenian orator Demosthenes once laid out the sexual landscape of his world with a chilling, bureaucratic clarity. "We have heterae for pleasure," he stated, "concubines for the daily care of the body, and wives for the purpose of producing legitimate children, and to be a faithful guardian of our households." It is not a declaration of love, it is an inventory, a human ledger where women were categorized and compartmentalized based on their utility to the Greek male. To understand this world is to understand that for a woman in ancient Greece, her identity, her freedom, and her very survival were defined by the type of sex she was expected to provide. First, and most invisibly, there was the wife, the gyn. Her world was the oikos, the home, but specifically she was confined to a section of it known as the gynaeceum, the women's quarters. This was not a sanctuary. It was a prison of fertility. A respectable Athenian wife spent her life in a state of purdah that would rival any society in history. She was forbidden from attending the symposium, the theater, or the political assembly. She could not inherit property or conduct business. She was expected to be unseen and unheard in public. Her marriage was not a union of hearts, but a business transaction between her father and her husband, sealed with a contract called an engie. She was, in the bluntest terms, a piece of high-value property, transferred from one man to another for a single, overriding purpose, to be the womb of the state. Her entire existence was geared towards producing a legitimate male heir to continue her husband's lineage. Her fidelity was not a matter of romantic loyalty, but of genetic security. A man's adultery was a private indiscretion. A wife's adultery was a crime against the city-state itself, for it threatened to introduce an illegitimate heir, corrupting the pure bloodline of the citizenry. The punishment was severe and immediate. The husband was legally required to divorce her, and she would live out her days in shame, barred from all public religious festivals. Sex, within this context, was a duty, a scheduled, passionless agricultural act designed to plow the field and plant the seed. Her pleasure was not only irrelevant but considered dangerous. A woman who displayed overt sexuality was seen as untrustworthy, her passions a threat to the stability of the household. She was expected to be a faithful guardian, a silent manager, and a fertile vessel. Her husband, meanwhile, would return late from the symposium, his mind buzzing with philosophy and his clothes smelling of wine and the perfume of the hetaerae, and perform his marital duty before retiring, a stranger in his own home. The Greek man had successfully engineered a society where he could have his family and his pleasure, but never in the same building, and certainly never with the same woman. But a man's needs, both carnal and intellectual, were not to be suppressed, and so, outside the silent walls of the oikos, an entire ecosystem of female sexuality existed to service them. At the very bottom of this hierarchy were the pornai. These were common prostitutes, typically slaves or destitute foreign women who worked in brothels known as porneia. They were the lowest of the low, human chattel with no rights and no social standing. They were a public utility, a necessary outlet for the baser male urges, meant to protect respectable wives and daughters from assault. Their existence was brutal and short. Some were known to wear sandals that left the words, "Follow me," imprinted in the dust, a ghostly invitation to a life of anonymous misery. They were bodies for rent, nothing more. On the opposite end of this spectrum, walking a razor's edge of influence and infamy, were the hetaerae. We met them in the symposium, but to truly understand their bizarre position, we must see the world through their eyes. A hetera was defined by what she was not. She was not a citizen, not a wife, not respectable, and in this negation she found a strange and perilous freedom. Because she was not bound by the suffocating rules of the gyneceum, she could educate herself. She could learn to read, to write, to play music, to debate philosophy. She could move freely through the city, attend the symposium, and converse with the most powerful men of her day as their intellectual equal. Consider again Aspasia of Miletus, the companion of Pericles. She was a foreigner, a woman who could never be his legal wife. Yet she lived with him, and their home became a salon for the greatest minds in Athens. Philosophers like Socrates, artists like Phidias. Ancient writers claimed she coached Pericles on his most famous speeches. She was, for all intents and purposes, the First Lady of Athens. Yet she held this position without any legal standing, completely dependent on the protection of her powerful partner. And that protection was fragile. When Pericles' political enemies wanted to wound him, they did not attack his policies. They attacked Aspasia. They dragged her to court on trumped-up charges of impiety and procuring freeborn women for Pericles' pleasure. It was a public, vicious attempt to remind everyone what she was, not a stateswoman, but a foreign courtesan, a harlot whose influence was an affront to the natural order. She was acquitted, but only because Pericles, the great leader of Athens, reportedly wept before the jury and begged for her life. This was the paradox of the hetera. She could be the most intellectually liberated woman in Greece, but she was always one public scandal, one jealous rival, or one aging patron away from utter ruin. From the prison of the wife to the precarity of the courtesan, we arrive at the final, most unsettling category of female sexuality in ancient Greece, the divine harlot. We must tread carefully here, for we are entering a world where historical accounts are thin and scholarly debate is fierce. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, describes a custom at the grand temple of Aphrodite in Corinth that strains credulity. He claims that it was customary for all foreign women, at least once in their lives, to go to the temple and sit, waiting until a man chose them. The man would throw a silver coin in her lap and say, "I invite you in the name of the goddess." She could not refuse. She would then have intercourse with the stranger, and having fulfilled her sacred duty to Aphrodite, she was free to go home. Now, it is crucial to state that modern historians are locked in a battle over this account. Was Herodotus reporting a genuine, widespread practice of sacred prostitution, or was he repeating an exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated tale designed to make the Corinthians seem exotic and decadent? There is very little corroborating archaeological evidence, and some scholars argue that the texts may be mistranslating temple slave or priestess as prostitute. The truth is, we may never know for certain the exact nature of what transpired in these temples. But in a way, the verifiable reality is secondary to the philosophical one. The very existence of this story, whether fact or sensationalist fiction, reveals something profound about the Greek mindset. It shows a world where the chasm between a religious offering and a sexual transaction could be non-existent. The idea that one could worship a goddess by engaging in anonymous commercial sex is a concept so alien to modern morality that it forces us to reconsider the very foundations of their worldview. It suggests a reality where the body was not a temple for the soul, but a potential altar for the gods, where lust could be piety, and where the lines between the sacred and the profane were not just blurred. They were actively, and perhaps ecstatically, erased. And it is this divine justification, this belief that the gods themselves were driven by uncontrollable, often violent lusts, that forms the final piece of this disturbing puzzle. In the modern world, we often think of religion as a source of moral restraint, a set of divine rules designed to curb our basest instincts. The gods of ancient Greece, however, were not moral traffic cops. They were cosmic forces of nature, personifications of every human emotion, amplified to a terrifying, world-shattering scale. And no emotion was more central to their stories than lust. The Greek gods were jealous, vengeful, petty, and uncontrollably libidinous. Their mythology was not a guide for ethical living. It was a divine charter for chaos, a sacred mirror that reflected and justified humanity's own untamed desires. This divine worldview bled into the mortal realm, creating rituals and festivals where breaking social norms was not a sin, but a form of worship. To understand this, we must journey into the heart of the Greek countryside, into the mountains and forests for the rites of Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. He was a force of pure, unbridled nature, a god of the wild, untamed life that pulsed beneath the thin veneer of civilization. The festivals held in his honor, known as the Dionysian Mysteries, were not polite civic ceremonies. They were raw, primal, and deliberately terrifying. They were an organized, ritualistic descent into madness. The core of the Dionysian ritual was the pursuit of ecstasis, literally, to stand outside oneself. Through a combination of marathon drinking, hypnotic music, and frenzied spinning dances that could last for days, worshippers sought to obliterate their individual consciousness. They wanted to tear down the walls of reason and social convention and merge with the raw, chaotic spirit of the god himself. The primary worshippers, especially in the early cults, were women, known as maenads or the raving ones. Leaving their homes and their families behind, they would retreat to the wilderness, clad in fawn skins, carrying a staff known as a thyrsus topped with a pine cone. What happened in the mountains is the subject of horrified and fascinated accounts from ancient writers. Freed from the suffocating confines of the Gyneceum, the maenads were said to engage in acts of shocking abandon. The ritual of sparagmos was central to their worship, a rite in which they would, in their ecstatic state, fall upon a wild animal, a goat, a fawn, even a bull, and tear it apart with their bare hands, eating the flesh raw in a holy communion with their god. And woven throughout this ecstatic frenzy was sex. In this temporary autonomous zone, far from the watchful eyes of their husbands and fathers, the normal rules of sexual conduct were annihilated. Accounts describe wild, indiscriminate sexual acts, a complete surrender to carnal instinct as a form of divine worship. For a few sacred days, the most repressed members of Greek society became the most terrifyingly free. The men of the city both feared and enabled this. They feared the chaos, but they also understood the ritual as a necessary pressure valve, a way to allow the repressed energies of their society to explode in a controlled, religious context before they festered and tore the city apart from within. If the Dionysian mysteries were an explosion of primal chaos in the wilderness, the Phallic processions were a celebration of raw sexual energy right in the heart of the city. Forget subtlety, forget symbolism. During festivals like the city Dionysia in Athens, one of the main events was a grand procession, the Pompeii, where citizens would march through the streets towards the theater. And at the head of this procession, carried aloft like a sacred icon, was a phallos, a massive, often grotesquely large, and sometimes comically decorated model of an erect penis. This was not a fringe cultic activity. This was a state-sponsored public religious festival. Men and women, young and old, would line the streets and watch. Participants in the procession would sing bawdy songs, hurl creative insults at the onlookers, and engage in raucous, sexually charged banter. The purpose of this spectacle was twofold. On one level, the phallus was a potent symbol of fertility. Parading it through the city was a magical act, an appeal to the gods to bless the crops, the livestock, and the people with abundance. It was a life-affirming ritual, a celebration of the procreative power that sustained the community. On another, deeper level, it was an apotropaic device, a magical shield. In the ancient world, the erect phallus was believed to have the power to ward off the evil eye and avert bad luck. Images of phalluses, known as herms, were carved onto pillars and placed at doorways, crossroads, and boundaries to protect homes and travelers. By parading a giant phallus through the city, the Greeks were not just celebrating life. They were actively fighting back against the forces of death and decay, the act that modern society has relegated to the most private of spaces was, for the Greeks, a public weapon, a communal shield, a visible prayer. The sheer, unapologetic public nature of this reverence for the phallus is perhaps one of the most difficult things for the modern mind to grasp. It speaks to a world with no concept of obscenity, where the body and its functions were seen not as sources of shame, but as reflections of divine power. And why wouldn't they be? The ultimate justification for this worldview came from the very top, from Mount Olympus itself. The Greek mythological canon is essentially a 1,400-year-long chronicle of divine sexual misconduct. The king of the gods, Zeus, was less a benevolent father figure and more a serial cosmic predator. His myths are an endless catalog of seductions, deceptions, and outright assaults. He transformed himself into a swan to force himself upon Leda. He became a shower of gold to impregnate Danae while she was locked in a bronze chamber. He disguised himself as his own daughter's husband to trick her into bed. He abducted the young boy Ganymede to be his celestial cupbearer and lover. These were not cautionary tales. They were foundational stories. They established a divine precedent. If the king of the gods was ruled by his uncontrollable lust, if he acknowledged no boundaries and used his supreme power to satisfy his every carnal whim, what message did that send to the mortal men who worshipped him? It sent the message that power and desire were inextricably linked. It normalized sexual aggression as a divine right of the powerful. The actions of the gods didn't set a moral standard to aspire to. They set a behavioral pattern to emulate. When a powerful Greek man took what he wanted, whether it was a young boy in the gymnasium, a slave girl in his household, or a courtesan at the symposium, he was, in a sense, simply acting out his own small mortal version of a divine drama. The gods didn't just permit this behavior. Their stories actively sanctioned it. Mythology became the ultimate alibi. It was the sacred script that gave every Greek man permission to play the part of a god, and in doing so, to create a world of profound, enlightened, and deeply disturbing contradiction. So, we have journeyed through the fractured sexual landscape of ancient Greece. We have stood in the sun-drenched gymnasium where mentorship was sealed with a carnal price. We have lingered in the wine-soaked symposium where philosophy and paid pleasure were served on the same platter. We have peered into the silent, shadowed prison of the citizen wife and followed the divine, ecstatic madness of the maenads into the wilderness. We have seen a society that invented logic and yet worshipped raw, primal instinct. A society that championed the citizen and yet systematically subjugated more than half its population. The core, paradox, the unifying theory that explains all of this seeming madness is the profound absence of a single, simple concept: sexual privacy. For the Greeks, the act of sex was never just about two individuals. It was a public statement, a declaration of status written on the body of another. A man having sex with his wife was performing his civic duty. A man having sex with a boy was performing his pedagogical duty. A man having sex with a prostitute was maintaining the stability of the social order. A man having sex with a slave was simply exercising the rights of property. Every act was loaded with a public meaning, a social or political significance that dwarfed any notion of personal, emotional connection. Their world was not bizarre because they were oversexed. It was bizarre because, for them, sex was never truly personal. And what are we to make of this today? It is tempting to look back from the safety of our modern world, with its hard-won ideals of consent, equality, and privacy, and simply dismiss them as enlightened savages. It is easy to feel a sense of superiority, to thank our lucky stars that we do not live in a world where our leaders parade giant phalluses through the streets, or where our marriages are cold, calculated transactions. But to do so is to miss the point entirely. To do so is to ignore the unflinching, uncomfortable mirror that ancient Greece holds up to our own time. Are we truly so different? We have pushed sex behind closed doors and onto encrypted screens. But have we truly stripped it of its public meaning? Our society still uses sex to sell everything from cars to cheeseburgers. We use it to demonstrate status, to build celebrity empires, and to fuel political scandals. We obsess over the sexual lives of public figures, turning their private affairs into public spectacles. We have our own rigid, if unwritten, rules about who can desire whom, and we still pass judgment on those who transgress them. The Greeks held their symposiums in the andron. We hold them in anonymous online forums. They debated the nature of love while being served by courtesans. We scroll through dating apps, swiping left and right in a ruthless marketplace of desire. The fundamental impulses, to use sex for power, for status, for control, have not vanished. They have simply changed their clothes. The history of ancient Greece is not a story about pristine marble statues and noble philosophers. That is the tourist brochure. The true history is a disturbing and deeply necessary reminder of the contradictions that lie at the heart of any civilization, including our own. It is a testament to the fact that intellectual brilliance is no guarantee of moral consistency, and that the most sophisticated societies can be built upon the most brutal foundations. To understand our present, we must have the courage to face our unsanitized past. We must be willing to see our ancestors not as flawless titans, but as the complex, brilliant, and deeply flawed human beings they truly were. Their story is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, of institutionalized inequality, and of what happens when a society's ideals soar to the heavens while its humanity remains chained to the earth. If you have the courage for that journey, if you believe that history is not meant to be comfortable but to be true, then subscribe and join us as we continue to excavate the truths that have been buried for far too long.